This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and I am so grateful to have this place to talk about faith and politics and canceling and just all kinds of big ideas or canceling big ideas. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. It's really cool. We get to have these just incredible people, smart people. They come in good faith and goodwill, and I am thrilled to get to have these conversations. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And listen, I need a favor. This would be really helpful and meaningful to me, to the show, and what we're trying to do here. Go to Apple Podcast, find our page there for talking politics and religion without killing each other. Scroll down a few episodes to where they have the reviews and rate us, hopefully 5 stars, and then click on the option that lets you write a review. Here's why I'm asking. Apple, for better or worse, is the most dominant player in podcasts, and they won't give the likes of me the time of day. And that affects our discoverability on their app. Despite that, this show is in the top 1.5% of podcasts in the entire world, across all genres. But if we get enough reviews, that will actually increase our visibility on Apple. It will push us into the top 1%, and then more people can participate in the conversations, just like the one we're having today with Greg Lukianoff. Greg Lukianoff is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, aka FIRE, and one of the country's most passionate defenders of free expression. He's an accomplished author of several books, including Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate, The Coddling of the American Mind with Jonathan Haidt, and his most recent book, The Canceling of the American Mind with Ricky Schlott. He has also written on free speech issues for such outlets as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and was the executive producer of the documentaries Can We Take a Joke and Mighty Ira, which I just watched last night. I really enjoyed it, especially the fact that Ira is a Mets fan. So, you had me at let's go Mets. Was a Brooklyn Dodger fan before that. But Greg also earned his undergrad degree from American University and his law degree from Stanford, and yet still has a ton of street cred on Block Island, from what I hear. So, Greg Lukianoff, thanks for joining me. How you doing?
I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
I am doing great. I'm thrilled to be talking to you. I have so many questions. I've been basting in a lot of your material written and now the documentary. I got to go back and full disclosure, I got to watch the first film. But I was curious, is the next film going to be some kind of mashup between, cancel culture and Last of Us? Are you going to get into fiction? Like what's next on the film front?
The next on the film front is actually, there is a documentary of coddling the American mind coming out very soon. I'm actually forbidden from giving you too many details about precisely what that's going to look like, because it's a big surprise.
Okay.
But what's interesting about it is that the documentary from Coddling the American Mind is focused much more squarely on the mental health costs of the bad mental habits we talk about in the book, which is very dear to my heart. So yeah, that'll be, I think they're going to be announcing that in about a month.
Wow. So you kind of open the door to potentially a sensitive topic right out of the gate. I was curious, given your own experiences, at one point you generously shared a mental health crisis that you went through. I was curious if that experience and perhaps your ongoing vigilance in dealing with your mental health has made you in some ways more sympathetic to what you see going on college campuses, or less sympathetic, like rub some dirt in it, get over it. I've gotten over it. Like how has it affected how you see what's been happening on college campuses?
Well, the questions always rely on what audience you mean. So just so your listeners know, In Coddling the American Mind, my previous book with Jonathan Haidt, I talk about being hospitalized as a danger to myself in 2007. And I actually give more detail about what happened to me than literally anybody had ever heard before. My wife didn't know a lot of those details. My family didn't know a lot of those details. And one thing that I stress a little bit more in Canceling of the American Mind, my most recent book with Ricky, is that was to a disproportionate degree because of the culture war, because being stuck in the culture war was so alienating, so exhausting, and friends would turn on you, and right and left would be mad at you depending on the cases, and really hate your guts if you were defending ones that offended either their preferred sides. I got very depressed. But as I was recovering, I started learning cognitive behavioral therapy. That's all about developing better mental habits about how to talk to the anxious and depressed voices in your own head. And as I got better at that, I started seeing on campus like what I thought was adults modeling some of the anxious and depressed habits that I was being taught to fight in myself. But at the time, 2008, by the time I was recovering, students weren't buying it. They were like, okay, yeah, you're telling me to catastrophize, go to hell. Like I don't care. But around 2013, 2014, we started seeing students showing up on campus already catastrophizing, engaging in binary thinking, all of these overgeneralizing, all of these bad mental habits that will make you anxious and depressed. So we made the point, and we began working on this article in 2014, that the same habits that were going to be a threat to academic freedom and free speech on campus were actually going to be a threat to mental health. So my sympathy, how this affects my ongoing thinking of the situation on campus, the students have my sympathy. And I know that they're struggling. Who doesn't have my sympathy are the administrators and the teachers who are teaching these mental habits, because Coddling the American Mind has been a book that's gotten in front of almost 750,000 people. Like it's been an influential book. I'm blown away by how many people we've been able to reach. However, I feel like people are still missing its primary message. I think there are people who've read it and said, "Oh, there's a mental health crisis. Everyone needs more therapy." It's like, no, that's actually not what we're saying. We're saying that you're whispering into a generation of young people's ears that they can't handle their own lives, and they're believing you.
Yeah. It's you bring to mind two conversations I had, both of them in July, one at the beginning of July of 2023 and one at the end of July. The first conversation was with Todd Rose, whose work you might be familiar with.
Big fan of Todd Rose. He's a great guy.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. And it really opened my eyes to what we're experiencing on a primal human level when we're being canceled. It's something that we experience it physically. Because there's something instinctive about our survival that when we're being ostracized at such a mass scale, that we feel it palpably. We experience it physically even. And yes, there are those distortions that we go through, the mischaracterizing, the catastrophizing, the things that you go through in the book, and then in the Coddling, and then recount again in Canceling, the two books. But the other conversation I had, and I found this, I might be oversimplifying here, but Dr. Russell Moore, toward the end of I always end up getting into other topics other than his latest book. One topic that we got into was how we were raising our kids. A couple of his kids are around the same age as my kids. I have kids between the age of 18 and 22 now.
Okay.
And he was talking about, keeping your kids close enough and then slowly opening up those boundaries to them so that you can help them go through manageable crises, right? Yeah. So every crisis in their mind, sometimes the stakes are higher than others, but you help them think it through, or you help them go through the steps of managing it. So it was a very helpful tool for me. But I want to back up for a second. Sorry to editorialize here a little bit, but you already have me thinking. I knew this would happen. I want to back up a little bit. I've heard you mention that your grandfather fought the Bolsheviks and your father fought the Nazis while at the same time was being hunted by or would have been killed if he got caught by the Soviets. Can you tell me a little bit more about your family story?
Well, my granddad did fight the Bolsheviks. My father was part of an underground group called something like NTS or something like that opposed actually both the Nazis and the Soviets. The most dangerous thing he did was actually get kicked out of his Russian military school in the 1940s for being anti-Nazi. My mom, who is from England, kind of interpreted that as like, oh, you got kicked out of school, big deal. And it's like, no, she got kicked out of school during the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia for being anti-Nazi. Like and the way it was explained to him is, I have the lives of 120 little boys to think of. Because they if they thought there was any risk that this Russian military school might suddenly become pro-Soviet, they would have killed all of them.
Wow.
So I don't want to romanticize it too much, but my grandfather fought the Bolsheviks, and of course, sometimes in New York you'll run into people who are kind of like, "Oh, you're aristocracy." I'm like, no, we were several generations separated from serfdom, but we had been making good. My grandfather was studying at Kiev Polytechnic to become a professor, and my great grandfather was a judge. So we were kind of a success story of serfs who made good, and that was interpreted as in any other society that would have been considered, oh, that's a great thing, but under the Bolsheviks we were shot back in the head, in huge numbers.
That's so interesting as you describe it. I when I heard the headline of your background, your family's background, I immediately assumed that you were Jewish, like my family. In fact, our families are probably from a similar part of what then was the Russian Empire.
Yep. Pale of Settlement.
Yeah, Ukraine. We were in the Pale of Settlement. We were in what's called Chernyastrov, Ukraine.
Yep.
Similar story. Our family we can deduce that they had been there for about 800 to 1,000 years. And similarly, one of my great uncles was the mayor of that town. There were not restaurateurs, but like they owned a bar and served food. One was a rabbi. But that particular generation that was born anywhere between 1890 and 1900, very interesting, because my uncles, they were considering the early Bolshevik movement. Oh, is there something to this? And then found themselves to be the enemies of the Bolsheviks. One of the uncles was recruited by the Tsar's army to fight in the first part of World War I. And then obviously the Cossacks they came in and burned and pillaged at random. Well, not really at random, but I assumed that you were part of a Jew. But it's this descendant of serfs, you say? Yeah.
So not Jewish. Apparently, in the same haplogroup genetically as a lot of Ashkenazi, but it's a regional thing. But
yeah,
unsurprisingly, people marry each other,
right?
And have kids with each other. But no, not Jewish. But I always take it as a compliment when people assume I'm Jewish. And I point out, I'm like, Jewish. Like I grew up in the New York area among a lot of other Russian Orthodox and Jewish kids. So yeah, it made all the more intense by when I got to Stanford by the fact that I was constantly demanding better kosher food. Like, no, I just want better food.
A decent bagel.
Your bagels are terrible. I mean, here's a great sin. When I got to, there was a place called Izzy's Brooklyn Bagels in Palo Alto. That was one of the only places that had even halfway decent bagels. They had chocolate chip bagels.
No.
And I was like, how am I? No, that's wrong. That's immoral. And this kind of adamance about this and good matzo ball soup.
That's right.
Got people to assume things.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that your grandfather passed away before you were born. Is that right? But check this out. My grandfather died in 1932. Oh, Holy cow. So your
Yeah.
father must have been pretty relatively
6.
older by the time he got that you were born.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. My dad was 49, and I just turned 49. So it's amazing to have lived this much of my life and realize that I'm only now as old as my dad was when I was born.
Wow. So,
But yeah, so my dad's dad died when he was when he was 6,
okay.
and my babushka, who was still alive when I was a kid, could only afford to support one of the kids, and so she kept Alexander, Sasha, and she gave the other 2 kids away. And so my dad was an orphan in Yugoslavia in the 30s, and so like his entire childhood was just nightmarish. That being said, it does help you slap yourself in the face sometimes when you're whining about your own life, to be kind of like, well, at least I don't have rickets, and at least I'm not an orphan in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, a lot. So I was going to ask you how you learned your family's stories. I learned mine by the time I started driving. I would drive into Brooklyn. My grandparents were still alive. My mother was from Russia or Ukraine, as we said. My grandfather grew up in Brooklyn, the other old country. But I would spend entire days with my grandparents, my Baba and Zeta, and they would tell me the stories. My grandfather telling me more of what Brooklyn was like in the early 1900s. And my grandmother having very vivid memories of what it was like in Ukraine on a trip across the States. How did you learn your family's stories?
My parents got divorced when I was pretty young. But my dad is still alive, by the way. He's 97. He is a talker, so I just have them talked at me for long periods of time. But my babushka was recovering from a stroke, or not really recovering. She was, laid out with a stroke. So she never explained anything to me. She forgot that she could speak English, so she only spoke Russian. Really just stories from my dad. It's kind of interesting, particularly with the Ukraine war now. My babushka was from Kostroma, which is on the Volga River bend. And my dad always grew up thinking of himself as Russian. But given that my grandfather was from a place called Rilsk, right on the Ukrainian border, and grew up primarily in and around Kiev, I wonder what he would think of himself as these days. Because I'm, unsurprisingly, as a civil libertarian, I'm very much on the side of the Ukrainians versus Putin, who's one of my least favorite people on the entire planet. But I also wonder if my grandfather would have thought of himself as Ukrainian.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we're always Jewish, so it's whether we're in America, whether I'm in Ukraine, or whether even I have family in Israel.
There's an old joke about that, though. There was a great show called Brooklyn Bridge. It's kind of like, we're over there, we're Jews. We come here, we're Russians.
That's right. Before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Meza Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Meza and Meza Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mezawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mezawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. I was curious about something else about growing up. You described sneaking off to the library. you played football, you tried to be a tough guy, but sneaking off to the library.
Unfortunately, I kind of was a tough guy, but there's aspects of that I'm not so proud of anymore.
Yeah. Well, I do want to learn more about how you went from, I think it was most likely to be absent to Stanford Law. but I was curious, what kind of stuff were you reading as a kid when you snuck off to the library?
I was a sucker for newsreels. I would get the old New York Times, and I would just go and read present, reporting of big things. Whether all through World War II, World War One, the 1920s, 1930s. Some of the, sometimes you're interested in the grisly stuff. So also I was interested in things like Jonestown, sure. But it was so awesome to be able to actually flip through those things and see even just the advertising, just the sense of like a different era.
Yeah.
And so I always just kind of assumed when I was a kid, I was like, I'm gonna do something practical, in the middle part, but I'm going to retire as a history teacher. And I want to be a high school history teacher, by the way, because I love history. And that's a lot of what I was going to the library, just to read up on history, because it was. And the thing is, I didn't want people to know I went to the library on Sundays. And that was one of my, that was kind of my happy place. Because, I didn't want them to know that when I got into high school that when I started getting good grades, which I didn't initially get because, I thought I didn't. This is something that people don't get about class dynamics sometimes. Like it wasn't, there was a sense that it's like almost shameful, like to be a go-getter, like at least to be someone who actually has great grades and all this kind of stuff. And even though I could get good grades or when I put myself to it, it was easy. But I wasn't supposed to, and that essentially I would hide that part of myself a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm remembering that now as a kid, that if you excelled in school, there was a certain label that was applied to you, and that you couldn't, there was a sense that you couldn't necessarily hang as much with the tough kids. We started in New York and we ended up in central Jersey. And there was definitely that, there was a split persona in a way, that we still wanted to hang out with the tough kids whose families were from New York. And yet we had this, pressure to excel academically, and we had to figure out a way to navigate in both worlds.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing that I find interesting about code switching, the way it's talked about today. And I've had code switching explained to me as if someone like me would never understand what that means, and it's kind of like, no, I mean, like being from different class backgrounds. I mean, my mom is British and my dad is Russian. Like within Europe, you're not going to find two less similar cultures than British and Russian.
Yeah.
My mom, had an exaggerated sense. Okay, so my mom's ethnically Irish, grew up in Britain and thinks of herself as British. My dad is ethnically Russian, grew up in Yugoslavia and thinks of himself as Russian. But because my mom was a little Irish girl, she, like a lot of immigrants, she had a kind of an exaggerated sense of being British. So like I grew up with a very strong idea of needing to be polite. But on the Russian side, there's a very strong Russian value in brutal honesty. And those two don't always go together so well.
Yeah. So a lot of the questions that I was curious about is around when you started becoming aware of concepts like the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, those freedoms that are outlined, especially in the First Amendment, but throughout the Bill of Rights. When did you start becoming aware of those, and what began to form your understanding and your own views of those freedoms?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the nice things about, growing up in a community with a lot of other first generation and immigrant kids. Because growing up in the 80s, a lot of the other kids were from Vietnam, they're from Korea, they're from authoritarian, parts of South America, they're from China. And a lot of them were fleeing, either communism or totalitarianism or authoritarianism of some kind. So all of us got free speech, and none of us took it for granted because that's what our parents were running away from, and that also made us in some ways kind of solidly 80s kids,
Yeah.
that free speech by the 80s was starting to become, not quite, but starting to become sort of a consensus opinion. Definitely had been championed by the left for a long time, but on the right, the country seemed to come together with a strong sense of freedom of speech, which was one of the things that made America different. So from day one, I was big on free speech. The thing that really got me more radicalized in that direction was going to college and being a student journalist. And then you see how people come into your office. By the time I was an editor, people will come into your office and demand that you punish this guy or apologize for that story or retract this thing, because they're offended by it, they didn't like the story, but they hadn't figured out the rationale yet. And watching someone be like, "You got to punish this columnist," and then being like, "Why?" and then realizing they didn't know yet.
Yeah.
They just knew that it bugged them and there has to be a rationale. And they would very quickly figure out, oh, this rationale will probably be the most effective. This is the most likely thing that will convince them to. I can't remember what the primary arguments were at the time. Certainly saying it was offensive was pretty common already by the mid 90s. But when you realize that there's such a human instinct to censor, you realize that free speech protections have to be very broad. Now, there are also the things that contributed to it. Living in Eastern Europe for a while, which I actually lived in Prague instead of Russia. I'm always. It never seems like the right time to go, and now with Putin there, I don't want to have anything to do with it. When it comes to I did refugee law in Eastern Europe as well. And then there was a passage of the Communications Decency Act in 1996, which was this attempt to ban indecency on the internet.
Yeah,
which is laughably unconstitutional. You don't need it's just way too vague, way too broad. And so by the time I was deciding to go to law school, I really was like, I'm going to law school to do First Amendment. I'm going to law school to do free speech. And that's what I specialized at Stanford. I took every class that it offered in First Amendment. I interned at the ACLU of Northern California. And when I ran out of classes, I did 6 credits of my own creation on censorship during the Tudor dynasty, which, by the way, comes up a lot in Canceling of the American Mind, because so many of the parallels of the attempts to ban the printing press, how much relevance they have for our current disruptive technology, social media. The parallels are all over the place.
Yeah, I really appreciated listening to a bunch of your other interviews and reading some of your stuff, that you could be talking about Henry VIII and to contextualize freedom of speech. A lot of times, obviously, you go back to Locke and some of the Enlightenment thinkers, but you go way back. You go back to Socratic, times. And so I love the historical, the history of philosophy, how it contextualizes your thinking. To help understand the issues, I thought that Mighty Ira was a good film for a lot of reasons. It was a fun watch, just on its own merits as a documentary, as a film, but it also instigated a lot of thought. So I was, first of all, can you describe, Mighty Ira is about Ira Glasser, who was the longtime exec director of the ACLU, if I remember correctly. And much of the film deals with the ACLU's decision to defend Nazis, the Nazis' right to assemble and the freedom of speech in Chicago, and ultimately to march in Skokie, Illinois, which led to a major Supreme Court case in the late 70s. So I was hoping that you could describe some of the details of the case and the significance of that case.
Yeah, so that was something that made an impression on me and a lot of young liberals, back in the 80s, was the fact that there was an organization out there so principled that even Jewish lawyers would be willing to go into court to defend the free speech rights of people who were their gravest enemies, Nazis. And that kind of principle really made an impression on a lot of us. That essentially it's like, wow, you really mean it. Like you understand that when you create exceptions to free speech, that ends up working against the most oppressed in your society, even if that means sometimes you have to defend people who are vile. But it showed something very pragmatic about it too, about freedom of speech. What destroyed the American Nazi movement in the United States in the late 70s, early 80s? It was being made fun of and making themselves look ridiculous. Now, of course, there were neo-Nazis who came later. But when you look at the moment when the Illinois Nazis were putting themselves together, nothing made themselves more ridiculous than actually seeing them protesting. And we actually show a fair amount of footage from the actual protests in Mighty Ira, and they look absolutely ridiculous. And of course they do, because they're idiots. And of course, being growing up, them being a joke in Blues Brothers, mockery actually did a lot more to put them in their place than anything else. And also, when you look at other moments in history, when you repress someone, and this happened to the real Nazis in Weimar, by the way, is that the various attempts to censor them, to send them to jail for saying anti-Semitic things, which is something that a lot of people don't know. There's this idiotic thing that comes from advocates of speech codes, that it's like, if there had been hate speech codes in Weimar, that would have stopped the rise of the Nazis. And it's kind of like, it's a ridiculous argument from the get-go, because it's kind of like, yes, and then those would have been enforced by people who were voted in by a population that more than a third of them voted for Nazis. So like it doesn't make sense even on the basics. But what they completely did not know, and clearly did not, is that there were laws that allowed you to punish anti-Semitic speech, and Nazis actually went to jail for saying anti-Semitic things. And of course, when this happened, anytime that they tried to censor Hitler, for example, say that he couldn't give speeches on college campuses, they turned this into a PR victory for the Nazis, basically saying, what does this man have to say that's so amazing that he's not even allowed to speak on campus? Or when I think it was Stryker, who got out of jail in the 1920s, when he got out, they turned it into a rally, basically saying like, they tried to silence us. So a lot of times motions to silence backfire. Meanwhile, letting the idiots talk sometimes can really defuse it. And of course, the real lesson of what should have happened in Weimar Germany is that they had way too much tolerance for right-wing violence. And if they had gone after Hitler, for example, I don't know, trying to overthrow the government in 1923, killing a police officer in the process of it, instead of sending to jail for a slap on the wrist, in a lot of other societies he would have been hung. And although I'm not generally in favor of capital punishment, I do believe that the world would be a better place if they had just hung Hitler in 1924.
Yeah. So that brings up an interesting question. Where is the line where it's no longer about assembly and speech? Do certain freedoms have limitations? And if so, what would be example? Where is that line?
Sure. So here's the big thing. And Europeans tend to think that our American First Amendment is crazy. And whenever I go over there, I'm always explaining about how actually I think they're doing it wrong, which is a very rude thing, but I do actually believe they are. But also, do you speak to the French and Italian? Do you speak louder and slower English to make sure they understand you better? No, I'm totally kidding. A lot of times when I go over there, and I say this because American constitutional lawyers, for the most part, particularly those of us educated at fancy schools, we're supposed to go over there and go, "Oh, we're fools over here in the U.S. and you guys have it all right." Like it seems to be like the politeness norm that we're supposed to follow, and of course, some constitutional lawyers actually believe that. Yeah. I don't. I don't think, since both my parents are European and I lived over there a lot, I don't think of it as some magical utopia over there. I think they got a ton of things wrong. And when I come over and explain, the American First Amendment, I explain the primary difference between your system and our system is we have something called the bedrock principle. It was established in a case called Texas v. Johnson in 1989, a case about whether or not you're allowed to burn an American flag, something that a lot of Americans find deeply offensive. And that bedrock principle is you cannot ban things in our country simply because they're offensive. And to me, this is also a bedrock idea for a genuinely multicultural, diverse society. Because I think about the neighborhood I grew up in. You know, my friends who had Vietnamese parents had very different ideas about what was offensive. My friends with Korean parents, same thing. My Peruvian friends, my friends from Brazil and Portugal, they all had different ideas of what was offensive and what should be banned. My mom and my dad had very different ideas about what shouldn't be what shouldn't be allowed. So if you do have a genuinely diverse society, then saying, listen, offense is too subjective. It's too different from person to person, from era to era, from culture to culture. That can't be the basis of it. So instead, we have narrow categories of exceptions to the First Amendment as a way to try to constrain their abuse. And so some of the exceptions to the First Amendment, which are entirely appropriate, by the way, number one is true threats. Saying that you're going to kill someone or otherwise, talking in a way that indicates that they're in serious, that a reasonable person would believe that they were in imminent harm of bodily harm or death is not protected, nor should it be. I actually think that on social media, we made a mistake not actually going after people who issued death threats as effectively, because I think this led a lot of people to believe, oh, I guess death threats are protected speech. And that seems ridiculous. And it's like, well, no, they're not, nor should they be. And nobody should be threatening your lives. Of course, incitement to imminent lawless action is not protected. That's actually a very tough standard. Comes out of a case called Brandenburg from 1969. And that's that if you're saying, let's burn down the mayor's office, in front of the mayor's office with an angry crowd with torches, then like that could be incitement. It's also conspiracy to burn down the mayor's office, by the way. So the incitement standard gets very close to the sort of conspiracy standard and aiding and abetting and all these other things. But discriminatory harassment is not protected on campus, for example. It's just not considered an exception to freedom of speech because it's considered a pattern of behavior that's not just about the offensiveness of words. It's about, it's about severe, persistent, and pervasive pattern of behavior that discriminates against an individual on the basis of race or religion, for example. So I actually think that the American First Amendment, the exceptions that it have make a great deal of sense. And that's one of the reasons why when people, are like, oh, these ridiculous free speech absolutists, I'm like, yes, there are people out there who think there are free speech absolutists. You're not going to find a constitutional lawyer who thinks that they are.
So just to make sure that we piss off everyone.
That's what I do for a living.
Yeah. So two of the categories that you described that were not necessarily protected is incitement to violence and discriminatory harassment. So would you describe not just Trump's speech on January 6, 2021, but in context of all the actions between the election of 2020 and January 6th as incitement, number one, and then to make sure that we're all inclusive of pissing off everyone, would you say that since October 7th of 2023, that there is an emerging pattern of discriminatory harassment against Jews, especially on campuses in America?
That's a very effective way to piss everybody off. So when it comes to the current question about whether or not the question as presented to the court is whether or not Trump's January 6th speech by itself constituted the incitement standard, because that's the only reason why you would need to go directly just at the speech is to make the argument that it fits within an exception to freedom of speech. And by the very tough standards of Brandenburg, and there are First Amendment lawyers who think that by this standard, it's too hard to get to incitement, or some of us, wonder if maybe that's not the right standard for a president, for example, since it has to be imminent lawless action and has to be clear that what you're recommending is let's burn down the mayor's office, not let's go and angrily, peacefully protest. And imminence, that it's just right about to happen, and some of that analysis is hurt by the fact that the protesters have to walk a mile. Like at the White House, I live in DC. This is all right over there. The White House and the Capitol aren't that close to each other. So I don't think that what Trump did is Brandenburg incitement. However, the stronger argument is whether or not it's aiding and abetting, whether or not it's actually conspiracy to commit a crime. And I think that that's actually going to be the tougher issue before the Supreme Court. I run a nonpartisan shop. I have my own, and I'm open about the fact I'm a Democrat. I have my own opinion about whether or not it can actually reach that standard, but it's we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say. But anyone says that part of the analysis is easy is not being truthful. Like that's a more serious allegation. When it comes to what's happened since October 7th, we have seen an uptick in discriminatory harassment on college campuses against Jewish students. We have seen an uptick in threats against Jewish students, and we have seen an uptick in incitement. Again, it's such a hard standard to meet. That's I'm not sure I've seen exactly incitement, but we've seen someone rightfully arrested for issuing death threats against Jewish students, and absolutely by all means punish that person. We've also seen an uptick in pro-Palestinian students shutting down, like disrupting dorms, disrupting study hours, disrupting classes, and all of that can be punished and should be punished. Really, we are, however, seeing an uptick in the targeting of protected speech by pro-Palestinian students, and FIRE defends them. A lot of the discussion has been around two things: shouting intifada, or the chant "from the river to the sea," the Palestinians shall be free. And the question is, since those are understandably interpreted by Jewish students as calls for genocide, particularly "from the river to the sea," is that unprotected incitement? And the answer is, again, because of the Brandenburg standard, no. And going back to the bedrock principle, because it can't just be because it's offensive, the answer is no. But you also have to remember what people mean when they're saying it. Yes, I get it. I completely, I'm extremely sympathetic to Jewish students who hear that. And that sounds like they're saying, kill me. And that's like they're saying, wipe my people off the map. But when the Wall Street Journal actually started quizzing some of these students who chanted "from the river to the sea" and showed them maps of here's the river, here's the sea, here's Israel, they didn't know that meant that's gone. And the fact that they actually, in many cases, probably thought what they were saying was resist justice for oppressed people does matter in the analysis. If they actually thought they were saying, I'm going to kill you, then you start getting the territory of true threats. But in this case, are intifada by themselves, or is saying "from the river to the sea" by itself protected speech? Yes. However, can any of those things be part of a pattern of discriminatory harassment? Yes. Can they be part of incitement? Can they be part of true threats? All of the above, they can be, but it can't just be the statement undirected by itself. Right.
That's it's an interesting distinction in a time and a culture that has a shallow capacity for nuance.
Yeah. So people feel like they don't have time for it, and I understand that. I'm pretty nervous about this upcoming political year, and I get people feeling like the time for nuance is over, but we still need it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading "Canceling of the American Mind," the one that came out almost at the same time. I think about a week after October 7th. It could have been all written after October 7th with how prescient a lot of the analysis was. But that's interesting. So my own position would be that I think I would defend the right of someone whose views I found deplorable, for lack of a better word, highly objectionable. But there's a line somewhere between. There was a gathering the Wednesday after October 7th of Jewish people and supporters and friends at the town, the city hall, just to gather and mourn. Frankly, some of us, a lot of us, have family in Israel, and at that point didn't know
Yeah.
if our cousins were dead or alive. But there were several trucks that were circling in the parking lot, and River to the Sea that was being chanted. Where it became ominous is when people came out of their trucks with baseball bats.
Oh God.
Yeah, and
No,
not just
not
waving
good.
flags, but intimating that they were going to use their flagpoles as weapons. So I think that there's a line somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but when there's this imminent threat of violence, that seems to be less under the umbrella of protected speech.
Yeah, and under those circumstances, the standard requirement would be the police to make sure that, if it looks like something bad's about to go down, that's when they have the power to, separate people, for example. Now, what they're not supposed to do, there's something called the heckler's veto, which is very applicable on this. And even though the heckler's veto has a colloquial meaning, which is basically that you don't give in to the people, throwing rocks at you, in the law, the heckler's veto would be a bunch of angry pro-Palestinian protesters show up with baseball bats, and the police then tell the people, they tell the Jewish people to go because they can't, because you made these people angry. That's the definition of heckler's veto in the law, and it's not supposed to be allowed. That essentially it's like, nope, sorry, we can't let you intimidate the speech with the intimation of threats from going on.
Yeah. So let me zoom out for a second and speak more theoretically. I've heard you describe your own views and draw a distinction between the marketplace of ideas, which a lot of folks advocate for, versus I don't know how you would put it, but I think the last interview I heard you say just generally knowing what people think and why. So I don't know if you have a name for that. That's going to be the title of your next book. But so marketplace of ideas versus knowing what people think and why. Describe the difference and why you advocate for the latter.
Yeah. So I call my theory on freedom of speech is I call either the pure informational theory of freedom of speech, or, when I'm being sort of more literary, the lab and the looking glass theory. And how do I distinguish that from the marketplace of ideas? Marketplace of ideas is a argument that Oliver Wendell Holmes came up with, that essentially the idea is that free speech should be protected because we're in a battle for the supremacy of ideas. Like what idea is going to win out in the competition for ideas? And Holmes was a Darwinian, so that colored a lot of his thinking about things. And marketplace of ideas is not a bad image for higher ed, for example. Like where literally it's supposed to be, at least in theory, in scholarship, unfortunately, it doesn't work at all like this, that good ideas will win out as more evidence adds up and people become persuaded that maybe their pet theories were not true. That's what it's supposed to be like, but campuses are more dysfunctional than that. So I think it's funny that marketplace of ideas is the least popular in the place where it's most applicable, which is higher ed.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that doesn't get to the full value of freedom of speech, because freedom of speech, a lot of what people talk about, frankly, it's not just about trying to defeat someone in a battle of ideas. That's a tiny portion of what you say in a day. That's a tiny portion of what we use our speech to mean. A lot of what we talk about is our preferences toward things, our opinions towards things, not trying to convince anybody even. About banal observations about the world in some cases that actually are more revealing about who we are than what the world looks like. So this is what I mean by the pure informational theory of freedom of speech, that if the goal of human knowledge, the goal of the project of human knowledge, the goal of the humanist project going back centuries, is to simply know the world as it is. And it actually turns out that process is a lot harder than our intuition tells us it is, that our intuitions are wrong, that our folk wisdom is wrong, that when you put a lot of these things to a test, they're not really true. That if the goal is to even for a minute understand what the world actually looks like, there's a really essential part of this that is missing in a regime of censorship: what people really think and why. And you do not, and you cannot understand the world in which you live in which everybody's too scared to say what they really think. So I think that one of the great values of freedom of speech is letting people know what they really think and why. And, Harvey Silverglate, my mentor, put it very simply, is I want to know who the Nazis are in the room, because I want to know, I want to know who not to turn my back on.
Right, right.
But he's absolutely right. And it emphasizes one of the things. It's like, you're not safer for knowing less about the world in which you live in. You're not safer because you don't realize, how popular what we all might consider to be bad ideas actually are. And there's another part to this, which is group polarization, which is, and this is something we talk about in the book, that essentially the way you get group polarization to really kick into high gear is you get people to talk to people they already agree with in large numbers. And that actually, very predictably, and there's lots of research on this, tends to make people more radical in the position of the group. Now, a less pernicious manifestation of this is if you go to if you go to a rally for a cause you believe in, you come back much more convinced, much more adamant on your side. Or for that matter, you go to a conference of like-minded people and you tend to become much more confident in the position of the group, much more radicalized in the position of the group. Censorship does exactly the same thing. And particularly when it's a legal regime, it convinces people, or at least it incentivizes people only talking to people they already agree with. Because censorship doesn't change anyone's opinion. So what that means is if the Nazis are only going to talk to other Nazis, and I think that this is something that France should have put together before they actually passed some of these anti-Semitism laws in France, in the 90s, is that what's that going to do? That's going to basically tell all the anti-Semites to only talk to other anti-Semites. They're not going to talk to people they're not sure about, because that's going to, maybe they'll get reported to the law, but they'll talk to other people they know are simpatico on that. And that very predictably will make them more radicalized in the direction of the group. Meanwhile, a de-radicalizing power is talking to someone who disagrees with you that you respect. And so freedom of speech can actually be a great de-radicalizing power if we respect it, not just the legal norms, but the culture of free speech, which includes things like hear people out, everyone's entitled to their opinion, not even if that other group's opinion is troubling, but especially if the other group's opinion is troubling.
What's interesting is that as I hear you talk, as I've engaged with your work, there are so many different disciplines and domains that have to intersect, that have to have dialogue with each other, from psychology to sociology to history to law. And a lot of these, if for years and years, just this morning, I went back to the original article that spurred the book with Jonathan Haidt. And I pulled this quote: by almost any definition, critical thinking requires grounding one's beliefs in evidence rather than emotion or desire, and learning how to search for and evaluate evidence that might contradict one's initial hypothesis. You could be talking to an evolutionary biologist, or you could be talking to a psychologist. You could be talking to, there's any number. It's interesting that a lot of these are worth continuing. The problems that have metastasized, so they need to be, we need to continue to talk about it. But at the same time, all of these disciplines are centered in higher ed, and a lot of the problems are centered in higher education. So I was curious, one more quote, and then I want to ask you to maybe go into some of the prescriptions, if you will. Toward the end of Canceling of the American Mind. By the way, that last quote was from the original article in The Atlantic from 2015 that led to the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, that came out in 2018. This comes from the end of The Canceling of the American Mind. Given that higher education is the wellspring of the perfect rhetorical fortress, an engine for conformity, and ground zero for cancel culture, the case for reform could not be stronger. And small changes around the edges aren't going to cut it. We need big changes. So what might be some of those big changes?
Yeah, right now, I think that, first of all, FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, my organization, we just came out with 10 common sense reforms that could help improve the atmosphere for free speech on campus, but also for the discovery of truth. And it includes things like remembering that the point of higher ed, the point of certainly research universities, is the discovery of truth. And that the reason why, as John Haidt points out, that you can't have both two, you can have more than one telos. Telos means kind of the purpose of something. You can have a social justice university, but then you can't actually really have a truly open-minded truth university. Now, I immediately understood what he meant, but I've been surprised sometimes to hear younger people be like, well, what does that mean? Can you be both truth and social justice? It's like, no, because what it means to be pro-social justice is to know where you're supposed to end up. It's supposed to know what assumptions are true. What the search for truth means is actually constantly looking at those assumptions and going, are these even correct? What's the evidence against them? Could I be wrong about the thing I hold dearest in my heart? What is social justice? All these kind of things. So search for truth, is something that universities haven't been focusing on enough, and they need to get back to. So we have a whole list of ideas and reforms. I do actually think we'd be living in a much healthier country if we weren't so disproportionately reliant on elite colleges, particularly the ones in the spotlights right now. Harvard, Penn, Yale, for that matter, are schools that have terrible track records when it comes to freedom of speech. And that scares me that people educated them at these schools are treated as much more deserving of, the big jobs and the fancy political appointments. And frankly, I think they should be. So something that comes out of the current kerfuffle around elite higher ed is that we rely less on the fancies in order to establish, and forget the Marxist expression, but who our ruling class is. I think that would actually be a healthy step in the right direction. But as far as something that I think would really help is smaller, cheaper, more rigorous experiments of other ways that people can show that they're well-read, that they're smart, that they're hardworking, and we need a lot of them. So someone, like me, who was going to the library on weekends wouldn't, and thought the idea of going into debt to go to college just sounded suicidal, and wouldn't have gone unless I was a scholarship student. That we need other ways for people to show how smart, hardworking they are, other than these models that they currently claim, and this is going back to more elite education, that they cost $70,000 a year, and that $70,000 cover less than half the cost of educating a single student for a single year. And what does that money pay for? A bigger bureaucratization, a bigger administrative class, which is one of the reasons why free speech and due process has been in such trouble on campus. So I do actually think that a lot of the solutions are particularly looking at regulations, looking at regulatory barriers to having smaller solutions. I think that we massively have to de-bureaucratize universities. A lot of those bureaucrats are actual threats to freedom of speech and academic freedom. They're the ones who enforce the speech codes, and actually, in some cases, will get together the disruption of the speeches. Will actually, in some cases, be the ones who are encouraging students to sign petitions in order to get professors fired. So we have to be doing some big thinking, and we can't leave the status quo like it currently is. And honestly, even if it was just cost, even if it was just cost and bureaucratization, the path we are on is not sustainable. You can't keep going up and up and up like this. So I'm hopeful that, unlike the last time we had a big threat to free speech on campus, which is, which I call in the book the first great age of political correctness, where once there were a couple of lawsuits and people seemed to fall out of love with enlightened censorship, that we all kind of took our eyes off of higher education, and things just got worse. Now we have to actually be like, there's got to be a way to do this better for everyone.
Yeah. Do you think things are moving? So your own law school, Stanford Law, had a very high profile incident where I forgot the names, but it was a conservative, a Trump appointed judge was invited
Kyle
to speak
Duncan.
by FedSoc. Yeah. There was another case where, and again, forgive me for forgetting the names, an attorney who argued some cases before the Supreme Court. She represents freedom of religion cases. I think that one was at Yale. And in both cases, it was basically shut down by a screaming mob who just really disrupted the entire event. So how, if you were, if you were king of the world or king of Stanford Law, king of, like, and you could wave a magic wand and say, this could have gone better, and here's how would incidents like that have gone better?
I think that you needed to start that process long before that incident took place in the first place. And it has to start on day one by explaining the philosophy of freedom of speech, the scholarly mindset, which is one where you're supposed to be radically open-minded and take very seriously the likelihood, actually the certainty, that you are wrong about any number of things. A lot of your assumptions simply are wrong. And also, they should have cultivated the habit of listening, not just debating, actually listening. And that's one of the reasons why, even though I'm a lawyer, and I think debate can be extremely valuable and extremely helpful, some of the projects where it's literally like have someone come in from a very different walk of life than you're familiar with and explain what it's like to be them, they give me hope. There's actually a project that I read about in which students from Kentucky went to the Bronx and met students from the Bronx and high school students. And by the end of the day, the goal was to be able to describe yourself as the other person. Basically, they'd be paired off in groups, one from the Bronx, one from Kentucky. And by the end of the day, you were supposed to be able to talk about yourself as if you were the other person. These empathy building programs, I think, really get at a lot of the old sayings that we all believed in when I was a kid that we think are good representations of free speech culture. Old sayings like to each their own, everyone's entitled to their opinion, it's a free country, walk a mile in a man's shoes. All of these ideas that basically were just little sayings that we all took for granted as being cliches, but also true, that remind people, check yourself. Like, you're wrong about stuff. Your certainty is not correct, and it's not your it's not your right to demand that other people think things that match what you think.
Yeah. So I had an experience in part of the book, the latest book, you dealt with Dave Chappelle's, I think it was 2022 or 2021, The Closer, and how a number of employees at Netflix basically wanted to deplatform Dave Chappelle altogether. They were trying to force the hand of upper management and the folks who are in charge of programming at Netflix. Now, full disclosure, I know a lot of those people. I'm in the entertainment industry. I've had a practice in headhunting and which, by the way, somebody said, you can't say headhunting anymore. I'm going to say headhunting. I'm sorry. I'm going to do it. It's a small scale.
Why can't you say headhunting anymore?
Because their explanation was that it was cultural appropriation and painting a negative light of certain indigenous peoples. And I was like, you're reaching, man. You are reaching. The reason I say headhunting is because it pisses off my competitors. They want to say executive search. And I'm like, I say headhunting. Anyway, it's headhunting and small scale mergers and acquisitions in the entertainment industry. So I know a lot of those people at Netflix. So when Chappelle, when a lot of those folks stood up and, did a walkout or a Zoom out or whatever that day, I posted something that I thought could have been not innocuous necessarily, but like, we can all agree, like, in the freedom of expression, even if we find a lot of his jokes unfunny and even cringeworthy, there's still the freedom of expression. Man, it was like dogpile on the rabbit. I got my ass kicked.
Oh man.
But so my question here is, what advice would you give? Not that was like the most egregious example of canceling or an attempt to cancel. What advice do you have for someone who is the target of a cancel culture mob?
When you're already a target, I think a lot about trying to raise kids who aren't cancelers. Like, I actually think like we should be focusing more on not being cancelers ourselves, because a lot of times it's too late by the time someone's already being targeted. I definitely think that for the most part, you can't be canceled outside of your own tribe. Because we point out cases where university professors are targeted from the right and actually do get in trouble. And that's about 1/3 of the punishments we see. But the reason why that isn't actually an exception to you can only be canceled by your own side is that the people ultimately doing the firing, for the most part, are also on the left as well, because the supermajority of administrators tend to be left leaning, and the professors that are targeted by the right are also left leaning themselves. So generally, you can only be canceled by your own side, and that's one of the reasons why having no side can be helpful. And I think a lot of us feel like we're orphans, and we seek the comfort of other orphans. But once you're actually facing, a cancel culture mob, if you're a boss, you should say, we don't respond to we don't respond immediately to calls from social media to fire somebody. We have a process in place. It takes several weeks in order to investigate it ourselves, and includes a cooling off period where we try to find some facts. But we do not respond right away to demands that we fire people. Now, this is important and can work in 90% of cases, because a lot of the cancel culture mobs burn out. They create the impression that there are 5,000 people, demanding that you fire your IT person, when there actually might be 5. Amazingly, corporations would do whatever they said, for a long time. And if you have some process in place, the push to get them fired will oftentimes desist. When it comes to one thing you probably shouldn't do, and this kind of breaks my heart to have to say this, because I do generally think that you should follow your conscience on apologies, but from a tactical standpoint, don't apologize. Like, if someone's trying to get you canceled, they don't give a damn about your apology. Actually, they will take your apology as essentially confessing you're a witch and just confirming everything that they believed. The people who have done the best in these circumstances, they don't apologize. They stand by what they said, and they try to immediately, find some people who will be on their side. So when they tried to cancel Steve Pinker in the summer of 2020, after getting so many people fired, in that year, and 2020 was a huge year for cancel culture. It didn't work with Steve Pinker, partially because he didn't apologize for anything, and he had a existing base of fans across the political spectrum who took him seriously. So that one fizzled.
Yeah, no, there was another one not too long ago in the entertainment industry. Kevin Hart had to step down from being a host. I forgot which show it was. It might have been the Oscars even. But he was originally scheduled to be the host of one of the big awards shows, and something was dug up in that he posted a dozen years ago. And then, his initial response was, well, we saw this and I dealt with it at the time. I don't feel the same way anymore. I'm not going to deal with it again. We're not going to do this again. And because that was his stance, he ultimately wasn't able to host that awards show. But I respect his position where, no, you're digging something up. That was, I talked about this. We rehashed this over and over and over again. And I'm not going to talk about it anymore. I'm not going to apologize for it again. It is what it is. Leave it alone. Let it lie. So on the one hand, he wasn't able to continue being the host because the organization had to make an organizational decision of, on their own. But Kevin Hart's doing fine,
Yeah.
So,
in the book, we talk about a lot of industries hurt by cancel culture, and the one that we left the most confident in, the one that we felt like was doing the best, was the chapter on comedy, where essentially, comedy has a natural resistance to ideological capture. I think there are definitely some stories of it, embarrassing stories of political correctness in comedy or cancel culture in comedy. But overall, as far as the sector that I think is the most likely to recover from all this stuff, it's definitely comedy.
Yeah. So I want to start to wrap up, and I want to ask you what we call the TP&R question: talk politics and religion without killing each other. What do you think? And we've been talking a lot about answers to these questions, but I want to hit it head on. What do you think each of us can do to be better able to share space with, have better conversations with, and even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So people who think differently than we do, have different beliefs than we do, get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
First thing is to want to, which I think too few people actually even want
Yeah.
at this point, particularly influential people. I think those numbers are improving, somewhat, and I think groups like Braver Angels kind of give me hope. Monica Guzman's in a great book. I forget what the name of it is, but about
I never thought of it that way, which echoes a lot of your sentiments, or your findings.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of great advice in there. I definitely would recommend that. I think it was one of my book of the month, and I'll probably re-up it at some point. So I think there's a ton of great advice in there. There was some recommendation that, don't just jump into, just don't start watching Fox News or MSNBC to check yourself. That's something that will just tend to make people more alienated and more angry. But there are usually publications that actually are trying to talk to, take a more center standpoint and explain things to hostile audiences. So that might be a good starting technique. And definitely, as far as like ways to mentally prepare yourself, one thing that I really worry about for this generation is the problem of presentism, which is essentially only thinking of the last, say, 5 years as the sum total of the knowledge you need to know. And I find that reading older books can make you much more open to the idea that there are people who can see the world very, very different from you, and they're not bad people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what the right word for it is, but there's a version of presentism. It was the lens through which many people applied to what happened, what's happening in Israel right now between Israel and Palestine. And it's applying the lens of oppressed versus oppressor, of those who come to colonialism, applying the lens of apartheid to what's happening there. And it doesn't comport with the history of what's happened in that part of the world, either in recent history or over the last 100 years, let alone the last several thousand years. So last question, do you have any questions for me?
I usually start with, how dare you?
In that case, I will just let folks know that you can find Greg or FIRE, his great organization, online. Greg can be found on Substack at greglukianoff.substack.com. The name of his Substack is Eternally Radical Idea. Eternally Radical Idea, greglukianoff.substack.com. Or you can find him on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Greg Lukianoff, GLUKIANOFF. I'll definitely include this in the show notes, or Threads at G Lukianoff. And the website for FIRE, a great organization, is thefire.org. That's www.thefire.org. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about Talk Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. We are easier to recommend than ever. It's politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E and S as in Sam, at Corey S. Nathan. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.